I've enjoyed tremendously the debates that Shabir Ali and I have had this week. And on this, the last night of our week of debating, I must say I'm stunned at the weakness of his response to the arguments that I've given. Consider the first one, that Jesus of Nazareth claimed to be the Son of God and the Son of Man. Shabir hasn't disputed this historically at all. He's not tried to dispute the authenticity of any of those sayings of Jesus that I offered you tonight. Instead, he gives a priori theological arguments, saying that you can't accept these because it's theologically impossible. Well, Shabir, you may have to change your theology in light of these events. That's the whole point. He says, but look, if Jesus died as a blasphemer, God would have no reason to raise him from the dead. But the point is, of course, is that he's not a blasphemer if he's telling the truth. And that's what the resurrection shows. Shabir says, but he blasphemed against God, and therefore by Jewish law he was a blasphemer. No, what the Jewish law says that any man who made these claims is blaspheming. But of course the whole point is that this shows he wasn't merely a man, just as C.S. Lewis said. Instead, he doesn't fit the category of the blasphemer. He falls into the category of the Jewish martyr. And God has vindicated the Jewish martyr by raising him from the dead, revealing that those allegedly blasphemous claims were not blasphemous at all. And remember, Shabir has never denied that he made those claims tonight. And you as a Muslim, if you are a Muslim, must believe what Jesus of Nazareth said, because he was a prophet. Now, the second point I made is that Jesus died by crucifixion. And here Shabir did not attempt to redefend his hypothesis of Jesus being taken down still barely alive. I pointed out that this is the theological equivalent of the flat earth theory, that no historian defends the apparent death theory anymore, because the professional executioners, who were the Roman soldiers, certainly could ensure the death of Jesus. If he weren't dead, he would have died almost immediately when taken down without immediate and drastic medical attention. So this apparent death theory, I think, is just desperate. Now, what about the resurrection? Shabir dropped his point about the accounts being contradictory, as I showed the historical core attested in all four Gospels. The empty tomb has never been disputed tonight, that the tomb is found empty. The appearances, he dropped his point there about the multiplicity of the appearances. Even his own scholars that he's quoted agree in a multiplicity of appearances after Jesus' death. What about the origin of the disciples' belief that he was risen? I showed there's a great hole in history on the Islamic view. Shabir responds, well, there were three kinds of messiahs. Not all were a Davidic messiah. But he must understand the argument here. Even if the disciples didn't stop believing in Jesus, say as a prophet, the point is that there's no anticipation of a dying, much less rising, Davidic Messiah. And that's what they later believed him to be. So you've got to explain the origin of that belief. And Islam can't do it because it doesn't have the historical antecedents to overcome his death as a blasphemer. Moreover, it never is able to explain how they came up with this un-Jewish idea that he was risen from the dead, when no one was supposed to rise from the dead until the general resurrection after the end of the world. The hole in history still remains. I then argued that the best explanation of these events is that Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead. And I offered a 4-point critique of Shabir's assumption into heaven hypothesis. Number one, I argued, it doesn't explain the belief of the disciples in the resurrection of Jesus. Why didn't they just believe, say, in his assumption into heaven? And Shabir says, well, they didn't preach the resurrection of Jesus. And he bases this on the book of Acts. But that's not the earliest sources we have. According to Helmut Krister, who is a professor at Harvard University, it is the creedal formula cited in 1 Corinthians 15, which goes back to within 5 years after the crucifixion, that makes it probable that this understanding of the gospel was shared not only by the church of Antioch from the very beginning, but by those to whom Jesus appeared, such as Peter and James. What Paul preached, he says, was never the subject of controversy. Jesus' death and resurrection was the event upon which their common proclamation was based. In fact, James D.G. Dunn says it remains an indisputable fact that the earliest believers were absolutely convinced that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. That was the message they preached. But you can't explain why they would preach that if they simply saw visions of Jesus. Now, my second point was that the New Testament consistently draws a difference between an appearance of Christ and a vision of Christ. We still have visions of Christ in the church today, but they're not resurrection appearances. And again, Shabir merely responded, maybe they had visions so strong that they continued to believe in him. But again, here he doesn't get the argument. The argument is, even the greatest visionary experience would at most lead the disciples, in line with Jewish beliefs, to think that God had assumed Jesus into heaven. But they didn't preach that. Instead, they preached his resurrection contrary to Jewish modes of thought and Jewish expectations. How do you explain that if all they had was mere visionary appearances rather than genuine resurrection appearances? In other words, what I'm asking is, if God did to Jesus what Shabir claims, then why wasn't that proclaimed by the disciples? Instead, they proclaimed something radically different, his resurrection, and that needs to be explained. My third argument was a theological argument that it's too little too late to rescue Jesus once he's already in the tomb. Because he's already suffered humiliation, shame, and persecution at the hands of his enemies. And that's what the whole motive of assuming him into heaven is supposed to rescue him from. But it doesn't do it. You might as well let him die and raise him from the dead, which is what the Jewish Christian belief is. That resurrection entails the death of the prior death of the person, otherwise it's not a genuine resurrection. So it's a part of the theory. Finally, my fourth objection was never answered by Shabir, and that is that on his view it turns Allah into a deceiver. Because Allah deceived the disciples into believing that Jesus was risen from the dead and foisted this delusion called Christianity upon the waiting world to its detriment, according to Islamic belief. So again, these arguments by Shabir are so weak if he is open to truth, as he claims that he is. I want to invite Shabir tonight to think about becoming a Christian. Honestly, this is where the evidence lies. And so I want him to think about that for himself in tonight's debate.
Thank you, Dr. Craig, for that engaging response, and thank you all for being so lively. I really appreciate that. It's fun. Actually, in some ways, I feel that I'm already a Christian. If being a Christian means an imitator of Christ, which is what the word really means, then every Muslim prides himself or herself in being an imitator of Christ. We believe that we have the same beliefs that Christ had. We believe in the same God he believed in. We worship the same God. And in some ways, we also worship in the way that he worshipped. In Matthew 26, verse 39, Jesus fell on his face and worshipped God. And Muslims do that even today. Now, more to the point. Dr. Craig says that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. And I didn't answer the point, he says, because I have a certain theology. And I should change my theology. But notice, it is not a Muslim theology that says it is impossible for Jesus to have claimed this. It is the logic of Christian theology. Because Christian theology, or more to the point, Christian apologetics, has it that Jesus made these claims